Good morning, y'all. Now, I want to be straight with you right at the top of this one because I think honesty with this community matters more than chasing a headline. The events I'm about to walk you through, the earthquakes that hit Northern California, Japan, and Venezuela, within about 24 hours of each other, those happened a few weeks back now on June the 24th. But I wanted to bring y'all a full breakdown today anyway, because honestly, the story is still developing in a massive way, especially out of Venezuela. And I don't think nearly enough people understand the science of why 3 earthquakes hit 3 different parts of the planet in the same short window, whether they're connected, and just how catastrophic the situation in Venezuela has actually become in the weeks since. So this is less of a same-day alert and more of a full sit-down explainer. And I think by the end of it, you're going to understand this event a whole lot better than the headlines gave you credit for. Let's start with the basics, because I always think it helps to ground ourselves in the plain science before we get into the specifics of each location. An earthquake happens when stress that has been slowly building up along a fault, which is just a fracture or a boundary between 2 chunks of the Earth's crust that are grinding against each other, finally releases all at once. Think of it like 2 pieces of sandpaper being pushed against each other. They don't slide smoothly. They catch, they lock, the pressure keeps building and building behind that lock point, and then eventually the friction gives way and everything that was stored up releases in a fraction of a second. That sudden release is what sends seismic waves radiating outward, and depending on how much stress was stored up and how deep the rupture is, you get anywhere from a gentle rumble that most people don't even feel to a catastrophic structure collapsing event. And I want y'all to understand something important right here at the start. The fact that 3 separate quakes hit 3 separate continents within about 24 hours of each other sounds dramatic. And it is dramatic, but it does not automatically mean they're related. The Earth produces earthquakes constantly every single day all over the planet. What made this particular day stand out wasn't that the quakes were connected, it's that the timing lined up in a way that got the whole world's attention at once. Let's go region by region, because each one of these 3 events has its own completely separate story, its own separate fault mechanism, and its own separate level of consequence, and I don't want to lump them together like they're one story because they're not. California first. Early on the morning of June 25th, a magnitude 5.6 earthquake shook Northern California, centered just a few miles northwest of Willits, up in Mendocino County. Now, 5.6 is a moderate earthquake. It is absolutely strong enough to be felt widely, rattle dishes off shelves, and give people a real scare, but it is nowhere close to the scale of what we saw in Venezuela. This one was actually notable for being the strongest quake to hit that specific area since 1940, so it had some real historical significance for that community, even without producing major structural damage. The fault responsible here is called the Makama fault, and I want to explain what kind of fault that is because the terminology matters. It's what's known as a right lateral strike-slip fault, meaning the 2 sides of the fault are grinding past each other horizontally, sideways, rather than one side thrusting up and over the other. The Makama sits as part of the broader San Andreas fault system, tucked between the San Andreas itself to the west and the Bartlett Springs fault zone to the east. This is one of the most seismically active regions in the entire country, and honestly, a 5.6 on a fault like that, while it makes headlines, is well within the range of what that region regularly produces. Officials reported scattered power outages and some minor injuries, but no significant structural damage, and several aftershocks followed in the hours after. Now let's talk about Japan. At roughly the same window of time, around 3:30 in the afternoon Pacific time on the same day, a magnitude 6.9 earthquake struck offshore, about 18 miles east of Kuji, up in Aomori Prefecture in northern Japan. This one is mechanically a completely different animal from the California quake. Japan sits right on top of the Japan Trench Subduction Zone, which is one of the most active subduction zones on the entire planet. A subduction zone is where one tectonic plate is forced underneath another. In this case, the Pacific plate is sliding beneath northern Japan. And that process produces tremendous amounts of stress that gets released in sometimes very large, sometimes very deep earthquakes. Japan is, without a doubt, one of the most seismically prepared nations on Earth, with building codes, early warning systems, and public awareness that most other countries simply don't have, and that preparedness showed. Despite the magnitude being significantly stronger than the California quake, the damage in Japan was limited, with some structural damage reported, including a partially damaged building wall in Hachinohe, but nothing close to catastrophic. That's honestly a testament to decades of earthquake engineering investment in that country, and it's a real-world example of how building codes and preparation directly translate into lives saved and damage avoided. And then there's Venezuela, and y'all, this is where the story turns from a series of interesting seismic coincidences into an outright humanitarian catastrophe. On the afternoon of June 24th, a pair of powerful earthquakes struck Venezuela's Caribbean coast within about 39 seconds of each other. A magnitude 7.2 followed almost immediately by a magnitude 7.5. I want y'all to sit with that for a second, because a magnitude 7.5 earthquake is an enormous release of energy on its own, and to have two quakes of that scale strike essentially back to back, before the region had any chance to even process the first one, is about as bad of a compounding disaster scenario as seismology produces. In a rare move, the USGS issued a red alert statement for this event, which is the highest level of alert their system produces, indicating they expected high casualties and extensive, widespread damage. Unfortunately, that assessment turned out to be accurate, and then some. The mechanics behind these two Venezuelan quakes are still being studied, but the leading understanding among seismologists is that while the epicenters were located within just a few miles of each other, the seismic wave data suggests they likely originated from different faults with different rupture styles. Most experts believe the first quake likely triggered the second. Essentially, the shaking and stress transfer from that first massive rupture was enough to push a nearby fault that was already close to failing over the edge. That's a well-documented phenomenon in seismology, and it doesn't require any exotic explanation. It's simply two faults that were both loaded with stress, located close enough together that one event was capable of nudging the other. Now let's talk about where things actually stand today, because this is the part of the story that I think deserves far more attention than it's getting. As of the most recent reporting, the confirmed death toll from Venezuela's twin earthquakes has climbed to somewhere around 4,500 people, and that number has been rising steadily, almost weekly, since the disaster occurred. Tens of thousands more remain injured, and tens of thousands of families remain without housing, many of them living in shelters and camps across Caracas and the hard-hit coastal region of La Guaira. And here's the part that I think is genuinely underreported. The U.S. Geological Survey's own modeling suggests the final death toll could ultimately land somewhere between 10,000 and as high as 100,000 people, once the full scope of the destruction is accounted for. That is an almost unimaginable range. And the reason the estimate is so wide is because of just how much uncertainty remains around how many people are still buried, missing, or uncounted in the hardest hit neighborhoods. The reason that number keeps climbing so significantly, week after week, comes down to a few brutal realities on the ground. First, there is the sheer scale of structural collapse. Reports out of the region describe hundreds of thousands of buildings either destroyed or severely damaged, and Venezuela, unlike Japan, does not have the same modern seismic building code enforcement that helps limit collapse in a major event. Many structures, particularly older or informally constructed buildings, simply were not built to withstand shaking of this magnitude. Second, there's the healthcare and infrastructure collapse, compounding the death toll after the fact. Aid organizations working in the region have been explicit about this. When the medical system in an area is already strained before a disaster, and then that system gets hit directly by the disaster itself, the number of people who die in the weeks after an earthquake from untreated injuries, lack of clean water, and disease can rival or even exceed the number who died in the initial collapse. And third, there have been persistent, serious reports of the emergency response itself being hampered, including accounts of international rescue teams facing obstacles getting into the hardest hit areas in the earliest, most critical days when survival odds for anyone trapped in rubble were highest. The economic scale of this disaster is also staggering. Damage estimates from UN agencies have put the total cost of destruction in the tens of billions of dollars, representing a significant chunk of the country's entire economic output in a single event. International assistance has poured in, including support from the United States military, with naval assets deployed to help move people and supplies through ports that were themselves damaged in the quakes. But for a country that was already dealing with significant economic and humanitarian strain before this event, a disaster of this scale represents a setback that is going to take years, not months, to work through. So let's come back to the question a lot of people are asking, which is, were these three earthquakes connected? Was the planet doing something unusual on June 24th and 25th? And I want to give you all the honest scientific answer here, because I think it's actually more interesting than a conspiracy-style "the Earth is going haywire" narrative would be. The answer, according to the seismologists who've studied this event, is no. California, Japan, and Venezuela were not physically connected. Large earthquakes can, in rare cases, trigger seismic activity in distant locations through something called dynamic stress transfer, where energy from a seismic wave passing through a vulnerable fault elsewhere can nudge that fault toward failure. But experts who've reviewed this specific sequence have said the California and Japan quakes were most likely coincidental relative to the Venezuela quakes, and to each other. Three separate fault systems, three separate tectonic settings, that simply happened to release stress within the same rough window of time. The Earth produces major earthquakes on a regular basis. What made this stretch of time remarkable wasn't some hidden global mechanism linking them together. It was the statistical coincidence of timing, combined with the fact that one of those three events turned into one of the deadliest natural disasters this decade. I think that's actually the most important takeaway from this whole event, and it's one I want to leave y'all with. This wasn't a sign that the planet's seismic activity is somehow ramping up in some connected, unprecedented way. Major earthquakes happen regularly in seismically active zones all over the world all the time. That is simply the nature of a planet with tectonic plates that never stop moving. What this event really was a stark, side-by-side reminder of how differently the exact same category of natural hazard can play out depending on preparedness, building codes, infrastructure, and emergency response capacity. Japan, with decades of investment in earthquake engineering and public readiness, absorbed a 6.9 offshore quake with limited damage. California absorbed a 5.6 with minor disruption. And Venezuela, hit by two quakes even larger than Japan's, is now, weeks later, still counting its dead by the thousands, with international agencies warning that number could still climb into the tens of thousands before this is all said and done. That contrast matters, y'all, and I think it's worth sitting with. Seismic hazard is not something any of us can control. Faults are going to keep grinding, stress is going to keep building, and earthquakes are going to keep happening in California, in Japan, in Venezuela, and everywhere else tectonic plates meet. But the difference between a 5.6 that barely makes the local news and a 7.5 that becomes one of the deadliest disasters of the year very often comes down to decisions made long before the ground ever starts shaking. Building codes, infrastructure investment, and a functioning emergency response system ready to move the moment the shaking stops. I also want to touch on the aftershock picture, because that's another piece of this story that tends to get dropped once the initial headlines fade. Whenever you have a rupture as large as the two Venezuela quakes, the surrounding fault network doesn't just go quiet afterward. It stays stressed and elevated for weeks, sometimes months, producing a long tail of aftershocks that can range from imperceptible to strong enough to bring down buildings that were already weakened by the main shocks. Geologists monitoring the region in the days after the initial quakes noted uplift effects reaching well beyond Venezuela's own coastline, with impacts felt as far away as Trinidad and Tobago, and reports of the shaking itself being felt in Puerto Rico despite the distance involved. That's a good indicator of just how much energy was released in that initial 39-second sequence. For a population already dealing with collapsed and compromised structures, that ongoing aftershock risk is a real and serious concern, because a building that's been cracked and weakened by the main event can come down in an aftershock that, under normal circumstances, wouldn't have been strong enough to do any damage at all. That's part of why search and rescue teams and structural engineers have had to move so cautiously through the wreckage in La Guaira and Caracas, even weeks after the initial event. I also want to touch on the question of accountability, because it's become a real part of this story on the ground. Humanitarian organizations working in the region have been vocal about the pace and adequacy of the government response, with some describing it as falling well short of what a disaster this size actually demands. There have also been persistent accounts from families and international rescue workers describing bureaucratic and logistical obstacles slowing down recovery efforts in the hardest-hit coastal towns. I bring this up not to wade into politics, but because it directly affects that death toll estimate I mentioned earlier. The difference between the low end of the USGS range and the high end of it is going to come down almost entirely to how effectively the recovery and medical response can be sustained over these coming weeks and months. If you want to help the people still affected in Venezuela, I'd encourage you all to look into reputable international relief and rescue organizations that are still active on the ground there, because the need has not gone away just because the story has faded from the daily headlines. And if there's one thing I want every person watching this to walk away with, it's this: earthquake readiness matters no matter where you live, because unlike a lot of the severe weather we cover on this channel, an earthquake gives you no warning at all. There's no watch, no advisory, no radar trend to track in the hours beforehand. It just happens. So if you live anywhere near an active fault system, please take the time to know your evacuation routes, secure heavy furniture in your home, and have an emergency kit ready to go, because the only real defense against an earthquake is the preparation you did long before it ever struck. I'll keep bringing y'all updates as the recovery in Venezuela continues, because this is a story that deserves to stay in front of people even after it stopped trending. Share this video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Stay safe out there. I love y'all.